Hello and welcome to the November 21st edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I am Anthony Bardaway. The electricity situation in Kiev is continuing to be difficult. I'm recording this late at night because late at night is the only time that we have reliable electricity for an extended period of time. We are on about 3 hours of electricity a day unless you decide to become a night owl, then maybe you can squeeze out some. The Russians have been systematically destroying a lot of the nodes that handle the electric infrastructure in Ukraine. This has largely focused on especially treating the electrical infrastructure in the cities to the east of Kiev, especially Kharkiv, Chernihiv to the north, Dnipro to the south, and making it so those cities rely on electric power from stations further out west, while also destroying a lot of infrastructure that takes that electricity from the west to the east. This is actually much more sophisticated than previous Russian attacks on Ukrainian electrical infrastructure. These are quite normal. We are used to having them at least every winter, sometimes other times in the year as well. But this time around, when before the Russians were much more random in their attacks, blow up this electrical substation here, at power plant there, and have the system be able to reinforce itself over time, this time they are really focusing on ways in order to break down kind of the backup plans that the electrical system has to make it so that those backup power plants, the ability to import energy from the European Union, they have learned where the weak points are. They have learned where Ukraine is able to draw extra effort out of and are finding ways to neutralize that. So this time around, it is, like I said, much more systematic, much more planned out, and therefore much more effective and dangerous. So, especially in these recent days, in order to accommodate all these difficulties, the power schedules have been severely, severely strict. So, I'd like to thank all of our Patreon subscribers. This month, someone was able to make a pretty nice sized subscription, and I was able to use that money to buy an EcoFlow, which is essentially a really big battery that will at least allow me to run my computer and a lamp for a few hours at a time. That will make things much more livable. I expect to get that maybe in about a week and a half. It's a very long line to get these batteries because everyone wants one. But again, thank you very much to my Patreon subscribers for that, to help me get through the winter. Patreon.com/Ukraine without hype and join our list of supporters. This episode, though, it will be covering some topics that I really wish did not have to be covered. This is not typically a very cheerful podcast. I am never overly optimistic. The way I cover things tends to be rather sober. I mean, it's the name of the podcast, Without Hype. But this time around, Ukraine is facing not one, not two, but now 3 major crises that, if it was only one and not the others, could be handled quite easily. But with it all happening at the same time, it's a tough hole to dig out of. And that is 1, the very difficult military situation, especially around Pokrovsk and now in the Zaporizhia region. 2, a corruption scandal that has racked the energy industry in Ukraine, the very industry that we are all paying so close attention to because of the outages. And 3, yet another Donald Trump peace proposal. After that, there'll be a few more stories at the end, but though that will be the core of this episode. So to start us out, military situation. Well, for starters, the Kupiansk sector seems to be largely stable, by which I mean that in the weeks since our previous combat update, there has been minimal changes. The city is a gray zone, but holding. But Pokrovsk, it has been a year, more than a year, since the Battle of Pokrovsk has been ongoing. Really, I consider this phase of the war beginning all the way back in February of 2024. February of 2024 is when the town of Avdiivka fell. Avdiivka was a linchpin in the defense of the southern part of the Donetsk region, and after breaking through that fortress, Russia began making its way to Pokrovsk. the next node in the defense network. And I kind of view this all as one battle, the battle from Avdiivka outwards to Pokrovsk. And so ultimately we're looking at, and since February of 2024, a fairly long time. But it has now reached its terminal phase. The last we talked about Pokrovsk, I said that the battle could come at really any time, either within a few weeks or even a few months. And while that time period has significantly decreased, I also can't really give a projection of when this will end, despite the fact that Pokrovsk is essentially destroyed. By now, almost all of Pokrovsk is gray zone, and Ukraine is continuing to hold on to the nearby village of Munorha. However, because it is no longer necessarily holding a solid defensive line, but is instead a series of brutal urban battles, it means that the attrition rate for Ukrainian soldiers is increasing. We saw this at the end of most major battles about the famous cities you've all heard of, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and others. When Russia is fighting its way to reach the city, the losses are much more lopsided. They are destroyed in the field on the way to reaching the city. But in urban combat, the losses are much more equitable. And though Ukrainians maintain an advantage in this area, the Russians also outnumber. So this is that dangerous terminal phase where the most lives are lost and decisions have to be made about whether to withdraw or not. And you've heard me do this rant every time that a battle is reaching its terminal phase of the Ukrainian military being slow to withdraw. I'm getting that feeling from Pokrovsk as well. Ukrainian special forces have been operating very heavily to the north of Pokrovsk in order to pry open the attempted encirclement that Russia tried to do. So no, Pokrovsk is not encircled. Russian propaganda has been saying time and time again that Pokrovsk is encircled. No, it's not. And in fact, the Ukrainian military has been able to loosen up the salient time and time again. But when they loosen up that salient, they use it to just rotate more soldiers in to hold on to it. And it's hard to make this call. I am not in the military. I never pass myself off as an expert in military affairs. We keep seeing this happen, and I would really prefer that the Ukrainian military put the focus on maintaining its soldiers, keeping its army alive, retreating to fight another day rather than holding on in these brutally deadly conditions that soldiers are facing in the Pokrovsk salient. Of course, the Russians are also facing severe difficulties as well. The town is one essential kill zone from drones. A lot of Russian units are purportedly hesitating to advance on the city because it is such a notorious battlefield where death comes at any time. Like it's a scary place for everyone involved, and the Russians don't enjoy it any more than anyone else, that's for sure. But when we see these battles forming on other parts of the front line, is this the best use of resources? I really have to question that, and I'm certainly not alone. If I was the only person saying that, I would not feel comfortable saying it on the podcast. Where the alarms are coming from all over the military right now that bad decisions have been made, and then there needs to be a shift to force retention. That said, no, the city is not encircled. No, Russians have not captured it. Even though Russia has been saying they've been capturing this city for the last month, it seems like every single day for the last month, I go to Russian sources and posters and things like that, and every single day they say we have captured Pokrovsk, and every single day, no, you have not. I don't know why they feel the need to lie every single time. You'd really think that people would catch on that if Pokrovsk fell 3 weeks ago, how can you say that it fell today? But that's not the kind of thinking you can really expect from Russia or its boosters. They just slurp up the propaganda at any given time without reflection or concern about whether it was contradictory to the thing that they had believed up until that point. They're not thinking people, so you can just spew propaganda at them no matter what. They'll believe it, even if it contradicts a thing they previously believed. But anyway, some of the Ukrainian counterattacks in this area have led me to believe that it might even be possible to hold Pokrovsk through the end of the year. Even. I don't know. And one of the reasons why I am so concerned about the need to distribute resources more effectively is that if we look at the Zaporizhzhia region to the city of Huliapole, in this town, talked about it so many times. The Russian advance towards it has been disturbingly rapid. Ukrainian defenses in this sector have been inadequate. The defensive lines to defend the city are mostly facing southwards and not facing eastwards, and east is where the attacks are now coming from. Infiltration and advanced assault units have moved ahead of the Russian army to the point where we have seen videos of Ukrainian soldiers getting attacked before they even knew that the battle had reached them. And while Russia is getting close to actually running into some of the defensive lines that do exist, which means that this advance doesn't have much longer to go. Honestly, they've been able to advance so far because they have not run into sustained defenses, because they have not really run into especially large towns. A lot of this area, I mean, I've described it before in the last episode, is largely rural, a lot of just empty farmland there, and have been crossed quite rapidly because of that. Huliapole is a much more heavily defended city, so for as much of the concern about this rapid advance that Russia is making raises in other observers as well as myself, it will reach a critical point in not so much longer, but by the time it reaches that critical point, now Huliapole will be in a similar situation that Pokrovsk was a few months ago, where you could come in and out of the city. It was not surrounded. It was not in any kind of salients or cauldrons or anything like that, but bringing the front line much closer to this town, which is so important to the defense of Zaporizhzhia region, is still extraordinarily dangerous, and there has not been an effective answer to it yet. But where this crisis comes in is that we are not really seeing an effective military response to this. If you follow a lot of soldiers, if you follow a lot of military analysts, they are not saying very positive things right now. They are saying about the many needs to reform the military, about how there is such a major problem with recruitment, and even more importantly, with desertion, then we're on the precipice of something very, very bad, if we aren't there already. I was reading through one list of recommendations from within the military that basically pointed out that soldiers just aren't paid very well, and especially elite soldiers are paid basically nothing. If you are a tip of the spear unit, if you're putting your life on the line in extraordinarily dangerous positions every single day, if you have to pay for your own gear, you have to buy your armor, buy your weapons, buy your drones, oftentimes by yourself, because the military does not have a large budget, you're doing all that for $2,000 a month, maybe. In Ukraine, that is a pretty considerable salary, but not outfit yourself as a soldier and nearly die every single day kind of money. And often they're being paid the same as anyone else near the front line, anyone else in a combat situation. And I hate to say that money is a driver for people, but people who do dangerous jobs get paid well for a reason. The Russians are able to generate the size of the army they can because they give very generous bonuses. And also, it's a way of saying that the military cares about what you're doing. A lot of the reason for desertions is because a lot of the soldiers feel like their lives are being thrown away for bad reasons, that they're being left in positions that they should not be allowed to be left in, and are barely receiving a thank you for the effort. Like, this is a problem, and I'm not just saying it, they're saying it. It has to be resolved. And increasingly, the demands are coming for the resignation of General Syrskyi, the commander of the armed forces. Syrskyi is seen as a micromanager who tries to control things on too low of a level. They see him as someone who takes too many risks, who tries to hold on to territory for too long. As I've referred to this battle from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk as one singular campaign, one singular unit, one thing that we have seen, especially in that area, is soldiers being left behind to be surrounded and killed, to the point where when they see this coming, that's when they desert. They see their officers be putting them in dangerous positions, and rather than stay in that position, they retreat on their own and often desert from the military. If they were not put in those positions to begin with, they would not desert. If other people did not hear about these things happening, they would not be so nervous about it happening to them that they desert. And these are happening under the guidance of General Syrskyi. Syrskyi and the people he appoints are making these decisions. And because of that, we are seeing increased assertion from actual combat units, particularly in Third Assault and others like them that have a higher number of elite soldiers in them, are saying that we make better decisions, obviously, therefore, put us in charge of reforming the rest of the system. And this is becoming a political problem. The campaign from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk, yes, took a very long time. As I described, it took much longer than anyone projected. Pokrovsk was expected to fall at the end of last year. It's gone on a year longer than anyone thought. That is a heroic stance. But still, time and time again, there has been cause to call Syrski's leadership into question. And again, it is not me saying this. If you follow Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian military commentators, they're saying it. Everyone's saying it. And when the battle for Pokrovsk comes to a conclusion, it seems as though there will be more calls for Syrski's resignation and more calls for heavy reforms within the military. There have already been some reforms. The change to relying on core structures, such as the Third Assault, most famously, have led to a lot of positive changes within the military, but again, only on a case-by-case basis in individual units that choose to make these changes and individual units that have better leadership and not an army-wide change. And because these discrepancies are so large and so noticeable, that's become more and more clear that it is a leadership problem. Where there's better leadership, changes are made that make things better for soldiers. Where the leadership has stayed the same, it is not. So that is our first crisis. The crisis of military leadership, the crisis of military confidence. All things are fixable. Many things have been fixed, but without further reform, without the military leadership making some very serious changes, discontent will continue to rise. Our second crisis regards around corruption. Now, this has long been the formulation of Ukrainian civil society, that there are in fact two wars. First, the war against Russia, and second, the war against corruption, the external war and the internal war. And while the full-scale invasion has made the external war a much higher priority, that has not meant that the fight against corruption ever stopped or ever faded away from anyone's minds. I'll turn you to the summer. In the summer of this year, there were a series of protests against a law that was about to pass, or actually had passed, that would have removed the independence of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. This is an independent agency that is heavily backed and favored by Ukraine's Western partners, that is put in charge of investigating corruption. And the law during the summer would have placed it under the direct supervision of the president's office rather than leaving it as an independent institution. This was recognized as an attempt to clip the wings of the anti-corruption investigators and make it so that they would basically be unable to investigate anyone within the executive branch, or really the government as a whole. But those protests did happen. Ukraine's foreign partners put heavy pressure on the government, and the problem was resolved really within about a week. But the question always remained, why did the president's office, why did the government want to make that change in the first place? And the most obvious answer seemed to have been that the former Deputy Prime Minister Chernitsov was under investigation by the anti-corruption cops, and that this was meant as a way to protect him. But that seemed like a not very good answer. NABU has been, or the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, NABU, has been very heavily protected since it was formed in the aftermath of Maidan. It is emblematic of the victory of the Revolution of Dignity. In the past, when any Ukrainian government tried to mess with NABU, there was a severe reaction. So why risk so much political capital? Why risk angering so many people to save this one guy? So everyone kind of assumed that something more was happening behind the scenes. And within this last week, we have gotten answers about that, which is really one of the largest corruption scandals of the war and broadly the administration of Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, it's very important before I go into further detail to point out that Zelensky himself has not been implicated in anything. He's not being accused, but some of his friends are. And we began to get some hints of what the next scandal would be not long after those protests. There were more noises made from within the government itself about the need to investigate corruption within the energy sector. Accusations were made against officials within the energy sector that they had not properly protected it. They had not hardened their facilities to attacks, and for that reason, there was more power outages. Something that really everyone is mad about. Yes, we all understand that Russia is blowing up power plants. The direct cause of our woes is very clear. It's Russia bombing. Throughout all of this, the primary problem is Russia killing people and bombing things. But still, people are not happy with losing electricity so often and will, in part, blame the government. And so, if you divorced this specific proclamation that there was corruption in the energy sector that had to be resolved, you could see that as answering this specific need. But then there's more conspiratorial side, and that kind of is where I'm leading, is that they saw this scandal coming, about to talk about soon, and had to get ahead of it by positioning themselves as also being against corruption in the energy sector. Because, oh boy, do we have a scandal about corruption in the energy sector that the president would have really wanted to distance himself from. And then November 10th, everything goes public. The National Anti-Corruption Bureau searched the residence of one Timur Mindich in connection with a corruption scandal in Energoatom, the nuclear power plant state-owned company of Ukraine. And so Timur Mindich will be our primary character of this tale. But before we go into who he is and who the other people implicated in this corruption scandal, I'll just give a quick word about corruption itself, which is that corruption has been, as I've already described with this whole dual fight situation, the primary goal of civil society has been to reduce or eliminate it. And they have gone to great lengths to do that. Whereas under the Yanukovych years, petty corruption was just how the world worked. Now there are, well, long-term foreigners who will sometimes complain about how you can't grease the palms of the cops anymore. The petty low-level corruption that has hindered the activities of the state for as long as recorded history, honestly, but certainly since in the post-Soviet institutions of independence has been so greatly reduced that it's not even really it's not something people interact with anymore. But that said, the higher level corruption is still very...
Well, first of all, you're going to have to grease the local politicians for the sudden zoning problems that always come up. Then there's the kickbacks to the carpenters. And if you plan on using any cement in this building, I'm sure the teams would like to have a little chat with you, and that'll cost you. Oh, and don't forget a little something for the building inspectors. Then there's a long-term cost, such as waste disposal. I don't know if you're familiar with who runs that business, but I assure you it's not the Boy Scouts.
Very much a reality. A certain amount of any large level deal will be expected to have a certain percentage of graft attached to it. Or, in the words of the late Rodney Dangerfield, which also reminds us that this is not a Ukraine issue. It's something that exists everywhere. And before I get too into detail about this scandal most of you listening to this are American. White-collar crime in America is essentially legal now. The enforcement arms of the FBI and other agencies are meant to deal with white-collar crime have been severely decreased. They don't have the resources to go after much anymore, which means it's legal to do. The amount of self-enrichment activities that the Trump administration and other high-ranking members of the administration have been doing is obscene. The first thing that Trump did on his second go-around was do not one, but two cryptocurrency rug pull scams. So before people like to feed into their stereotypes about Eastern Europe and post-Soviet space, and Ukraine in particular, about how it's such a corrupt area, well, when you point one finger, three others point back at you, is all I have to say about that. Okay, but what was this scandal? Like I said, this involved around Energoatom. State companies in Ukraine are quite descriptive of what they are. They're the energy company that deals with atomic energy. They operate the nuclear power plants, and Ukraine is very heavily reliant on nuclear power. Half of Ukraine's electricity needs come from nuclear power plants. Of them, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is under occupation by Russia and is now effectively shut down. So there goes one of Ukraine's most important sources of electricity. But there are still three more. Those are in Melnitsky, Rivne in the South Ukraine nuclear power plant within the Mykolaiv region. Massive company, very extensive contracts to service their various projects and supplies, and dealing with having such massive plants. This is a big money kind of operation here. And so this conspiracy within the government, within Energoatom, was to essentially solicit kickbacks for every single deal made with it. If you want to do business with Energoatom, you will have to pay 10 to 15% of that contract to this conspiracy, or you will not be able to do business with them anymore. Do you want to sell some trucks to Rivne nuclear power plant? Well, you're also going to have to kick forward 10% of the worth of that contract to Timur Mindich in order to have the right to do that. If you did not pay the bribe, you were barred from any contracts moving forward. And often, this dealt with just literal stacks of cash. If you look at the photography of these raids that have been going on, that have been carried out by Nabu, it's just actual giant stacks of cash. Altogether, the scheme totaled about $100 million. That's a lot of money. But again, big business, they're taking 10% of that business. 10 to 15% of a lot is a lot. This money was then directed through a back office in Kyiv and split among the alleged conspirators. Again, within the government, within the president's office. And a lot of this, as much of a scandal as it is, as horrible as it is as much anger as is provoking, the form of it is not unusual. I'd say that it's not really the form of the corruption that surprised people. Again, they're used to it. And also within the energy sector, and the energy sector is especially prone to this. I was just listening to an episode of the Lawfare podcast that was talking to this with my former colleague, Anastasia Lapatna. He's brilliant. Go listen to it. So I'm trying my hardest not just to repeat any of the talking points they made. I like to be original. But this one thing that I had to repeat that they did bring up is that many of Ukraine's most corrupt oligarchs came up through the energy sector. It's dirty. It's real dirty. One of the dirtiest. So a corruption scandal in it does not surprise people. Two things do. One, how far this conspiracy seems to go. And I'll get into the who's in a second. Don't worry. But how many high-level people, how many people attached to the presidential's office, how many people who are personal friends with Vladimir Zelensky who are involved in this is shocking. And the other point is that, again, because this is about that energy sector, the energy sector is the one that really people are feeling the closest hurt from right now. In my opener, I described how I get 2 to 3 hours of electricity a day. That is kind of unlivable. We're approaching winter. It's already chilly out there and dark. And when there's no sun out during the daytime and you can't turn on lights in your house, things get real miserable real quick. So people are thinking a lot about the energy sector right now. And the way that we see the energy sector is that it is redlining all the time to keep a basic level of livability within the country. Every moment where we have electricity is bought with the sweat and often blood of Ukraine's energy workers, of the repair people who go in after a missile strike and get things back in working order and often die in the process, of the air defense that keeps it going. And we see a system that does not have room for error. There's no wiggle room. Everything has to be going towards this end. The economy depends on it. People's lives depend on it. And we learn that a large percentage of it gets shuffled away to a personal bank account. That is infuriating. Oh, you meant we could have gotten another hour of electricity today, but instead the resources that could have been used for that are instead stashed away in some luxury building complex in the suburbs of Kyiv, which some of this did go to. Borderline treason.
And to make things even worse, it seems as though where they began to get more greedy, where that number turned from 10% to 15%, regarded the contractors who were building the defenses for the energy infrastructure, meaning that time and money was lost for where it came to building the actual defenses, the hardening features that would protect these power plants, transformers, etc., from Russian attack, which is the central problem that we're looking at here.
People are real mad. But yes, who is involved in this? The ringleader of this operation is Timur Mindich, the person who had his house searched and was supposed to be arrested but fled before the search happened. And the fact that he knew the cops were coming for him is certainly a part of the scandal. Who told him? Who is the leak? Who let him know? He's now in Israel, by the way. He fled the country and went to Israel, where he had actually spent a significant part of the war in. A significant part of the war at a time when men of military age, such as himself, face heavy restrictions from being allowed to leave the country at all. So add that to the list of things that people are able to be mad about, is that this guy who had been stealing from them had also found an exemption that allows him to leave the country and go to his house in Israel rather than be in Ukraine with everyone else. And certainly not without any of the exceptions made for the other people who are allowed to do that. And Timur comes out of the world of Dnipropetrovsk, of Kolomoisky, oligarch Kolomoisky, much like Zelensky himself did. This is kind of the clique. He comes out of the same group of people that Zelensky did. And in fact, they were close friends. People think of Vladimir Zelensky as just being a TV comedian, but that's not where his money came from. He was actually in charge of a very successful film company known as Kvartal. Now, there was their highlight TV show, which was kind of like a variety SNL type thing, but also was a general purpose film production company that produced a lot of projects that was successful not only in Ukraine, but also for many years in Russia even. This was a very successful business. Big time film producer. So think producer when you think Zelensky, not necessarily just comedian or actor. And Zelensky's business partner in Kvartal was Timur Mindich. So very, very close to each other. However, he wasn't really seen as a political player until about 2024. Before that, he was just a business guy in the background. Zelensky was very much the face of that company. No, he was still an active businessman with other projects, especially within the entertainment sector, but, a background guy, an extra in the larger Zelensky production. Though many people from Kvartal 24 did find work within the presidential administration. There's a lot of connections between Kvartal and Bankova. That's just who the team that Zelensky was comfortable with. He wanted to bring in his own, functionaries, secretaries, low-level, the kind of people that make an office run. Zelensky trusted the people who had already done that for him before. That's not unusual. That's certainly not a scandal. That's not any kind of, favorable hiring practice or anything like that. Every presidential administration comes in with the people that they know and trust. It's just so happened that rather than a political machine, that many politicians would come in with, Zelensky came in with this TV company. That said, even in his world as a largely anonymous business person, there's still scandal around him. His brother Leonid had been arrested in June for a corruption case revolving the energy sector in Kharkiv. And again, though he did not come into politics until late, once he got in, he became quite influential because he's one of Zelensky's close friends. A word from Timur's mouth will carry much farther than a word from anyone else. And so he played a pretty big role in appointment of the former Deputy Prime Minister Chernitsov, the very person who was in the corruption scandal over the summer, and again finds himself into this as well. Yes, Chernitsov, our former character from the last corruption scandal, carries over into this one. He is very much implicated in this scheme. But who else? We have Alexander Sukerman. Sukerman was another business person not directly involved in politics, and his job seemed to be allegedly, just put allegedly in front of everything. I'm supposed to say allegedly. Barely anyone has even been formally charged in this case. It's all coming out right now. Therefore, if I don't say allegedly, that's journalistic malpractice. So I'm asking you that if I don't say allegedly in front of any of these accusations, to just mentally place it in there. Okay. Make it easy for me. Okay. So allegedly, Sukerman was the person who handled most of the work of this scheme and is the one who channeled the bribes through that office in Kiev, the workman of this group. Our next character here is the justice minister, former justice minister, Herman Halushenko, who, though until recently was the justice minister, at the time when a lot of this scandal was happening, was energy minister. In July, there was a shakeup of the cabinet, people reassigned to things. He went from the energy ministry to the justice ministry. Halushenko comes out of the energy sector. He worked for Energoatom, but he was also an associate professor of private international law at the Institute of International Relations at Taras Shevchenko National University of Kiev. Probably it's disputable depending on what you're looking for, but probably the number one ranked university in the country. Which is why during a lot of the tapes that were confiscated as a part of this investigation, he's referred to as professor. Again, even he is not clean before this. He had a former deputy who was implicated in a corruption scheme about mining equipment at the front line, something that we had talked about at the time. Though as of yet, the direct connection that Halushenko played in some of this is less clear than that of Mindich, though on these tapes, he is listed as a beneficiary of the scheme. The next person who's attached to Halushenko is where things get a little bit twisted as well. That's Ihor Miranuk, who's an aide to Halushenko and is a part of this allegedly, a part of this scheme, was also a former aide to Andrei Derkach. Andrei Derkach was once the president of Energoatom, connecting everyone in through politicians who came out of this company at some point in their career. But Derkach is someone that we talked about many times before, and often his attachment to the energy sector is more of a footnote. But Derkach, who is now no longer in Ukraine, is no longer in Ukraine because he is a traitor and defected to Russia. And while he was in Ukraine, he was a major pusher of Russian influence. He had training with Russian intelligence services, went to the academy for it in Russia. So we don't know how much of a Derkach factor there is in this outside of the tenuous connection to Ihor Miranuk, but there is some reporting about how this Derkach connection is indicative of something bad, though I will not try to look much further on that because a lot of the investigation, it's still in its very early phases, and it seems as though this corruption may be more of a post-Derkach part of Miranuk's career, though he certainly learned it in his office. And those are the people that we have much more direct information about, we can say. More information is coming out every single day. There's lots of people who have not yet been named, but also we have to look at the energy minister, Svetlana Hrenchuk. Her name has been thrown around as being involved in some way or another, though the details of that have not been released yet. And the name of former defense minister Umerov has been mentioned, but the only thing that we know is that his name has been mentioned. We don't really have anything else to go on. Does it mean that he knew about something? It's not clear. We might know later, I guess. We do know that there was a lot of controversy over the fact that Umerov has been out of the country recently, but that's because he's not the defense minister anymore. He is largely a diplomat, kind of. He has a lot more connections to Turkey than most Ukrainians do. He is a Crimean Tatar. The Crimean Tatar community has a lot of connection to Turkey and has been treated as the kind of go-between between Kiev and Ankara. And recently, he has been in the United States talking about what will be our third crisis later on, this proposed peace deal, whatever. So no, he was not out of the country in order to flee justice. He was out of the country because he is a diplomat. That's what he does. Barring future information, of course. So what have been the reactions to this? We have this list of people, many of them, like Timur, like Chernetsov, who are personal friends with Zelensky, members of the cabinet, important people connected to the president, who did this kickback scheme within the nuclear energy sector. So what has been the response from the government? We'll start with the response from the government, then we'll go to the response from civil society. First, Hrenchuk and Halushenko are fired. They are no longer in the cabinet. They lost their jobs. They will need new ministers of justice and minister of energy. I'm sure they're looking right now. And overall, Bankova is trying to distance itself from this problem as much as they can, which they do have reason to do. As I said, Zelensky does not seem to be involved necessarily. That kind of keeps coming up. There's a lot of corruption schemes involve people being around Zelensky, but no one ever accuses Zelensky himself of being a part of them. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to make another reference to the Lawfare podcast. Go listen to Lawfare podcast, where they compared this to the presidency of American President Ulysses S. Grant, where the Grant administration had a lot of people who were super corrupt and is even seen in American history as historically corrupt, but no one really ever pinned anything on Grant himself. It just seemed to be everyone around Grant, with Grant not being involved. And that was a comparison that Lawfare podcast made that I thought was interesting. And so they're very much putting out at least the image of doing a crackdown. And so they are announcing a complete overhaul of the energy sector, going to look for any of the inefficiencies, going to look for where other corruption may be, find out where the problems are, fix them, get this going on the right course again. Root out corrupt officials, whole thing. What Zelensky directly said was, quote, there must be maximum integrity in the energy sector in absolutely all processes. I support, and the Prime Minister supports, every investigation carried out by law enforcement and anti-corruption officials. This is an absolutely clear and consistent position for everyone. On the public level, there's no resistance to this investigation, though the questions remain, including who told Timur the cops were coming. And as I said at the start, they had even tried to get ahead of this crisis by signaling, even before this case broke, of the need to go after corruption in the energy sector. They primed this position and are going for it. But how is civil society reacting? As I said, everyone's super bad. I have looked at everyone I could see, look at every statement, every, social media post from everyone involved in civil society, anti-corruption, the military. Again, military's not happy with this. And this is an outrage like I haven't seen before, at least since before the full-scale invasion, for the reasons I already listed. Among politicians, there's a large faction of the Servant of the People Party, Zelensky's political party, calling for a big crackdown on this. They are calling for the firing of Andrei Yermak. Yermak is Zelensky's right-hand man. His name has not been directly brought up in this scandal. People are presuming that he is involved. There is someone going by the nickname of Alibaba on the tapes that people think is Andrei Yermak, but it's not sure. But more importantly, Yermak is seen as the center point of any corruption that comes out of the presidential administration. He is seen as, the scheming vizier. Not many people like him. He has a very caustic personality, as I understand. When people hear that there's corruption coming out of the presidential administration, they just presume that he's involved. And as kind of the major domo of the presidential administration, they kind of understand him as being the one who knows what everything is happening within that administration and within the kind of inner halls of power, even more so than Zelensky. And so he is taking a lot of the blame right now, and people are calling for his resignation, not just in civil society. And all the people I'm hearing from civil society are calling for this, as they've been calling for it for a long time. Nobody likes this guy. But also within the legislature, within the party that Zelensky is the head of, Servant of the People. The opposition parties are calling for a national unity government, a government coalition that includes all the pro-Ukraine parties that still exist within the parliament. So it's not just Servant of the People being able to call the shots all the time, which is seen as one of the problems here, is that this political party, this political machine has so much power that it's hard to really move around them. They have an absolute majority in the legislature. They don't need any other votes, which is why they didn't need a national unity government. A national unity government is a normal thing in a lot of countries at war, but we just didn't need one. They had all the votes. They had a majority. They had almost a supermajority, but the calls are calling for them to have one now. Some of the opposition parties I would not like with a national unity government. Yulia Tymoshenko has been rather opposed to the anti-corruption offices in the past, so it would not be much of a contribution that she would have to this problem. But Holos, sure, maybe the party of Poroshenko can come in, but I see the value in it, and there's demand for it. That said, to go back to this idea of Yermak, because he is blamed for everything, I think this not might be so healthy to blame a singular person. He's kind of treated as the lightning rod of the administration. When people get mad, they get mad at Yermak, maybe when he's not even to blame. I'm sure he's to blame for a lot of things, but maybe not everything. And there's a very dangerous tendency within democracies, even not just autocracies, everywhere. There's this whole good czar, bad boyar comparison where the man in charge, he's doing fine. All the problems come from the nobility and the lower court and the local officials, but not the guy in charge. And this is a problem that really has a tendency to build into something real ugly. So I think we have to be careful about deciding how much percentage of the blame that Yermak can carry. And indeed, there was a meeting of the government shortly before I held this recording, in which purportedly this idea of firing Yermak came up and Zelensky rejected it. But with the scandal over the summer, something has to bend. Someone has to be blamed. This investigation will keep going, and as things come out, there will need to be more answers. And indeed, this investigation is already showing that it is expanding. Mindich was also connected to Firepoint, the company that makes the Flamingo missile. The missile that's being purported as, this homegrown Ukrainian missile that has a super long range, can take out targets in Russia. There has been, however, some questions about the company that makes it, and Mindich has been connected to that company, Firepoint. And these tapes that were confiscated include unnamed officers in the Security Service of Ukraine, the SBU, and the Economic Security Bureau. So there are lingering questions about how deep this goes and how connected it is to the law enforcement bodies of Ukraine. That investigation is also needed. And so we have, so far, this dual crisis. On the two wars that Ukrainians face, the war against Russia and the war against corruption, there have been serious problems on both fronts. Though I will say, to be more optimistic here, that the fact that this conspiracy was discovered and is being acted against and is being investigated is itself a victory. In the past, the pre-Maidan era, this would not even be a scandal. In the Yanukovych era, this is just how things were done. And importantly, this was a scandal that was uncovered by an arm of the government itself, by the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the special prosecutor. It's being handled by the government. It is not simply a case, as is often is, of civil society, of investigative journalists, of NGOs forcing the issue on the government. The rest of us really didn't know. The investigative journalists did not discover this, as is often the case. A government agency did. A government agency that, through public protest and international support, was able to protect itself from outside interference. So the system is working. The system that was fought for at the Revolution of Dignity is working. Just have to support it enough for there to be follow through, which we're already seeing. But together, these two crises are something that the presidential office has to answer for. On the military front, there needs to be reform now. There needs to be reform 3 years ago. We know what the problems are. We know who some of the problems are. And we have the military crying out to be fixed. And the longer these problems persist, the more Ukrainians will be dying in excess of just what you would expect from the war. The organization need to be overhauled, and you have to listen to the soldiers that know what they're talking about in order to do it. So that's one. And two, the presidential administration has a lot of hangers-on that are dirty. We are seeing that right now. We need to fully empower this investigation and see where it leads, even if it leads to Yermak himself, and if so, finally take action on that. The Zelensky administration has been, for all of its strengths in carrying out the war, quite resistant to criticism from inside the country. It has not been fully open to journalists. It has been rather dismissive regarding a lot of the outcries that have been ongoing. For most of this time, they have been able to use the boost in popularity that comes from the largely positive ways that they have handled the war, from the patriotic rallying around the flag. But that time has been over, really, since the summer protests. and they have to acknowledge they are not in that, golden era anymore. Politics are back, and they have to play politics, which means acknowledging criticism, changing, reforming, and not being so guarded. As it stands, there still is no call to replace Zelensky. Everyone understands this. Like I said during the summer protest, frustrations with the presidential administration does not mean that anyone is actually calling for elections or anything like that. We'll see where the demands go for a national unity government as opposed to the normal configuration where the Servant of the People Party has been able to hold its majority without having to cooperate. Who knows what kind of political configuration will result from this, but things need to change and things are being called for. But that leads to our third crisis, which is that all this is being seen as a moment of weakness by Russia and by hostile forces in the United States. So what happened is that apparently there had been a negotiation happening behind the scenes between the United States and Russia, the same one that we were talking about in our previous episode, but more specifically between Steve Witkoff on the American side and Kirill Dmitriev on the Russian side. And again, we talked about Dmitriev in the last episode. He is a presidential advisor, mostly on economic and business issues in Russia. But more recently, he has become a political envoy to the United States. He has been in the U.S., part of these negotiations. And ultimately, he's kind of a buffoon. He is a clownish figure who is clearly saying things that he is not being instructed to say even. He is just being given the directive to go out there and be a chaotic little gremlin. And be a chaotic little gremlin is what he did. During this corruption scandal, he figured it would be the best time to release a clearly half-baked, quote-unquote, peace plan to the Ukrainians. And it's hard to tell what exactly the political story is because it was so clearly half-baked, and the way everyone is responding to it is as though they were completely unprepared for this to happen. Dmitriev just leaked the contents of this peace plan to the news outlet Axios, which they then shared, very obviously to dismay of everyone else involved. And this final offer, as it is being called, because apparently after this time, the Americans are going to wipe their hands clean of this whole situation entirely, the thing they've said every single time. It involves territorial concessions, the entirety of the Donbass being given to Russia, but not officially to Russia. Instead, Ukraine would hold legal claim to it and rent it out to Russia at cost. And this is kind of what I'm talking about, this plan being half-baked. That doesn't really make sense, but it is the kind of thing that Steve Witkoff would come up with, a real estate lawyer, turn it into a big real estate deal where the territory is rented rather than sold or rather than taken by Russia. What does that even mean? There's a lot of course, confusion of what a security guarantee is. Initially, the leaked plan gave no real details of what a security guarantee was outside of putting sanctions on Russia, sanctions that would be removed with the signing of the agreement and then put back on if Russia breaks the agreement. Russia seems to be just happy having the sanctions on it now. Why would that be a deterrent? But after the leak of the plan and how it has been roundly criticized by everyone, from the Ukrainians, of course, to the Europeans, to even a lot of the Americans, Trump came out and said that there would in fact be better security guarantees than that, but only for 10 years. So I guess Russia would just invade in 11 years. Brilliant. But largely it is the same plan as we've seen time and time again. It's the same plan that has failed time and time again. So I don't know what they thought would be different this time, other than thinking that the Ukrainians, because of these crises, would be forced to sign a capitulation when they wouldn't have in the past. But because it is virtually the same agreement, and because I have gone over some of the point by points on it in the past, I don't really feel the need to do so right now, considering that this is already a long episode about much other different things. But I will say that the thing that has arisen from all these other attempts to get Ukraine to capitulate has been a rally around the flag moment. These things are seen as outside threats. They are seen as America trying to screw Ukraine over and therefore having to huddle around the positions that Ukraine is needing to fight off every accusation against it that could weaken its position in these circumstances. So really, while the presidential administration is beset by scandal, this is really the best thing that could come along for them from a domestic perspective anyway. And the presidential administration has, of course, seized on it already, as the line coming from presidential administration friendly Telegram channels, pundits, that kind of thing, has been that essentially these accusations being made against those close to Zelensky and perhaps leading all the way to the top were planted by the Americans in order to undermine the negotiating position of Ukraine and force a surrender. And though that isn't exactly being believed in full, the domestic anger on the scandals is strong enough to overwhelm that to a certain degree, but also to a certain degree, that's not a unconvincing narrative. There will be some people who believe that, because it is something that has already happened. When the US has been putting pressure on Ukraine before, the US has tried to ferment internal discord. The US has tried to do regime change in trying to convince some Ukrainian politician or another to replace Zelensky. That was meant with a resounding absolutely not, none of your business. So that component of the crises of the scandals will be also something to watch. But as with everything else, this is a developing story, and new statements, new everything are coming out every day. And even though this whole thing with a peace deal is only like 2 days old as of time I'm recording this right now, in between power outages, everyone is scrambling. Everyone is saying a million different things. There are claims and denials, and it is so confusing. Nothing makes sense. And Dmitriev, as I called him, the Chaos Goblin, really, really did a number. Really did a number on this, on everybody. Like, quite successful, unfortunately. And overall, not good times. Not good times. Now, because this was initially a news roundup type episode before production became nearly impossible and events transpired that drew attention elsewhere, I do have to kind of go over what some of these other topics I wanted to talk about were, but in a truncated and faster version. I don't want to hold out on that just because it's outside the narrative of, the 3-part act of this episode. So to begin with, attacks on journalists at the front lines have increased. October was especially deadly. I did a video for New Voice of Ukraine on this, so please check out New Voice of Ukraine. As always, a team from Die Welt was targeted while they were on assignment with an air defense unit. Neither of them were killed, though they were injured, but some of the soldiers who were accompanying them were killed. Alyona Gubanova and Yevgeny Karamazin from the outlet Freedom were killed near Kramatorsk by a drone attack. And they're clearly marked as press, both themselves and their vehicle. So this was a deliberate targeting in a drone attack that it has a camera on it. They know what they're targeting. They see the press markings and still targeted them, which is a war crime. And this outlet, Freedom, is one I used to work for in a different orientation. So that hit home. And Antony Balakin, a French journalist who I wouldn't necessarily say friend, but friend of a friend, someone who I had met on several occasions, very nice guy. Also in October, he was killed while the person he was working with, Ukrainian Georgy Ivanchenko, in that attack lost a leg. And part of this is that the kind of kill zone near the front is larger. The increased use of drones, the increased use of infiltration units has made the front line much more dangerous, and more importantly, the areas behind the front line much more dangerous. And in that area, the Russians are just killing almost indiscriminately. We also saw that a UN humanitarian convoy near Kherson was targeted. For example, again, a truck UN labels everything. The UN does not exactly travel in secrecy, very clearly marked, and that was hit by a drone attack. So even if they aren't necessarily hunting down journalists, they aren't excluding journalists either. They're killing civilians, they're killing the UN, although no one died in that attack. They tried to kill them, and just so happens that journalists happen to be there in the kill zone where everyone's being killed. And this isn't like artillery or something like that where, the Russians just fire and whoever's on the other side of where they're firing is who's there. These are drone attacks, again, with cameras on them that can see what they're doing, making a deliberate choice to target journalists, the UN, civilians. Though, of course, journalists may be being targeted directly as well. So the journalist community lost more people, and I suspect that we'll be losing more people. The next of these stories that really will require more attention at a later time is that there was a report that came out that counted the number of Ukrainians who have been conscripted into the Russian military and how the Russians are doing more extensive mobilizations and are preparing for more extensive mobilizations in the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, as well as a kind of companion story about how kids are being sent to military training schools and being directed into the army upon reaching adulthood. So Ukrainian children being raised to kill Ukrainians. There's another story about how AI chatbots, your chat GPTs, your Groks, etc., are being essentially pumped with Russian propaganda, and how the questions asked of them troublingly often come out with pro-Russian answers. And in a world where people are just asking AI, Google even is AI now, that could quickly lead to a much larger information crisis than one we are already facing. And turning to the Heritage Foundation in a story that I really do think that I will be covering in the future for perhaps Radio Free America from that angle, maybe, is that within the United States conservative movement, there is an ongoing schism happening that involves Tucker Carlson and those like him, kind of the ultra-right of the far right, challenging the rest. But if we look at the Heritage Foundation, the venerable, in so many words, center of intellectual conservatism, the intellectual part of that is telling their foreign policy people working on Ukraine-Russia issues to watch Tucker Carlson segments about Ukraine and have that determine what their findings will be. Tucker Carlson, entirely uneducated propagandist pundit who has been spewing pro-Russian propaganda all this time, apparently was telling the Heritage Foundation and its scholars, we can call them, what to do and what to think. So that's another one to watch out for, because yikes. So it's not like Heritage Foundation has been good. That's just so odd. And finally, we are receiving reports from Ukrainian partisans in the occupied territories that Russia could possibly be preparing for the mass deportations of Ukrainian citizens who are refusing Russian citizenship to Siberia. That is practically a cliche, to port the dissidents to Siberia. That's what Russia does. Its first, second, and third plans for everything is just to deport the people you don't like to Siberia. But in this case, again, something to develop at a later time is that this does follow the patterns of genocide. Though a deportation to Siberia is not as deadly as it used to be, what it does is disperse Ukrainians so that they are easier to assimilate into Russianness. And really, it follows the logic of Russia wants to eliminate Ukrainian nationality where they can. If their initial attempts to do that have failed by arresting and torturing and killing Ukrainian activists, artists, journalists, politicians, to cut off the intellectual vanguard of Ukrainian identity and allow, the truly Russian simple folk of the country, they would naturally fall into place as Russian. Apparently that didn't happen, and so you have to move on to more drastic measures. And as you attempt more things and move on to more things, they become more and more extreme. I was going to talk a bit more about Sudan, actually, and the things that we have seen coming out of Sudan, the massacres taking place, that satellite photography is literally showing piles of dead bodies and the sand stained with blood. So with that, we'll close off this episode. If you'd like to support Ukraine Without Hype, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype and join our list of supporters. Again, thank you all very much. My big battery is on its way, and I'll definitely be appreciating that one once it gets here. Tell your friends, family, like, review, do all the podcast things. Head over to our YouTube channel. YouTube is harder to do. It's certainly going to be more electricity dependent than even audio. So my plans to do a video pivot are more difficult than I even thought they would be, but I'll try. I'm going to try to get out another Crisis episode by the end of the month, but that requires lights. So I just need to time it correctly. But to thank our Patreon subscribers, thank you very much to Randy McNerland. The voices in my head are from Big Pharma, Kyle Smith, Giorgio, David Shepard, Ivanica Krotskaya, Mike, Michael Drucker, PLM, Arminius, T. Bart, Barbara Streisand, Devi, Anonymous, Michael Wickman, Jenny Louise, Marguerite, Kevin Alberton, Silas Frank, Dimitri Litvin, Dennis Napalm, Vivek, James Burke, Megan, Elizabeth Hughes, Nick Niazin, Andy S., John Gates, Sanjay, Grace Krause, Laura De Leon, Had to Laugh, Jacob Holm, Justin Devendorf, David Wall, Chris Bennington, Levy Grove, James Wise, Alex Groschmal, Ada McDonald, Jerd, Victor Matei, Scott Tokaryuk, Etienne Soleil, Anastasia, Captain Technical, Evelyn, Veronica, Matt Miller, Julia Lindsay, Emily Bavona, Scott Berry, Anonymous, Subtle Knife, Marianne, RDK, Francois, Lori Halila, Justin R., Christopher Lee, Kyle Johnson, Lemnikin, Demetrio, Ursula Zolenkoff, Noah Brown, Glowing Wind, Can Dystopian Fiction Please Remain Fiction, Marcus Naskis, Andrew Glenn, Zay Perry, William Brown, Abel Lenz, Kiwi Valley, Dana Jones, Joseph Verlone, Yellow Duck, Anonymous, Bucktron 2021, Florian Kunkel, and Matthew Rowe. Thank you all very much for your support. You're what make this all possible. And until next time, Slava Ukraini.